Welcome back, everyone, as we look at this companion video to the video we looked at yesterday, which was from the Great War channel on the Schlieffen Plan. If you did not see that video, link is in the description. It'll give you an opportunity to watch that one before you come back to this one. This is from our friend Cody at Alternate History Hub, who is doing his what-if scenario about what if the Schlieffen Plan actually succeeded. Now, I haven't watched this video yet. I have my theories on how that could have easily succeeded, and I talked a little bit about that in yesterday's video, but we're going to dive right into this one. As always, that link is also in the description below. I am so excited. We are now just over 3 weeks away from my planned trip to the battlefields of the Great War. I am in the process of putting together a video for you guys, giving you kind of a preview of exactly what I'm going to be doing, what those videos are going to be about, and how I'm going to present the material to you. And it's also going to be inviting you to have some input into exactly what videos I make. So that'll be coming probably in the next day or two. So be watching for that. Make sure you're subscribed and turn on your notifications so you'll find out as soon as that video goes live. Let's dive into this one.
Alternate history, it's always fascinating to predict the different timelines which would differ from our own. The slightest change can put the world down a much different path. For us, World War I was one of these events.
And I mention this every time we do an alternate history video. I know these aren't for everybody, and that's okay. The reason I like looking at alternate history scenarios is because it forces us to take a more critical look at what actually did happen by considering what might have happened if things had played out differently. So for me, it's actually just a unique way to study the actual history by talking about what-if scenarios. And with all what-if scenarios, we all have our opinions. There's no such thing as a right or wrong answer. So if I agree or disagree with him, or if you agree or disagree with me, it doesn't make one of us or either of us right. It just means we have different ways of looking at things.
It was so significant, nearly every major issue we see in our world today has origins in the conflict from a century ago. One of the most important was Germany's defeat. This loss led to the massive disillusionment inside Germany, the Weimar Republic, and eventually the rise of Hitler. Simply put, this loss directly led to World War II. So what if Germany had not been defeated in the war? More specifically, what if they in fact defeated France, Britain, and Russia using their original plan, the Schlieffen Plan? The Schlieffen Plan was a deployment plan created by Alfred von Schlieffen, basically as a thought experiment on how to deal with Germany's neighbors. Germany was surrounded by rivals, France to the west and Russia to the east. There would be no way Germany could win a protracted defensive war against France and Russia, so to win the Germans would have to quickly invade and take Paris. Only way to do this was to maneuver past the French defensive border by invading Belgium.
Now, I wouldn't necessarily say it's the only way to do it, but it was the only logical way to do it, because you have defenses along this line here. After the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 1871, Germany gobbles up a little bit of this disputed region here, Alsace and Lorraine, and France puts a bunch of border forts there, including Verdun and some other places, and it's just really heavily fortified. And so my logical point of divergence, and I'm guessing that's where he's going to go with this, but I don't know that for sure, is that Belgium stays out of the way. That was presented to them. Germany requested to pass through Belgium unmolested. They said, we don't want to take your territory. We don't want to fight you. We just want to pass through on our way to Paris. And of course, Belgium said no and put up much greater a fight than the Germans expected, especially around Liège. And that really completely derailed the Schlieffen Plan.
The army would have to quickly march on Paris, knock out the French, make peace on the Western Front, then send the troops to deal with Russia. Eventually, the plan became adapted as the best scenario in how to deal with these two in case of a war. Fortunately, once the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated and Europe mobilized its armies, the plan became a reality.
Cody.
Whoa, what's happening?
Cody.
Indy.
Sorry. I'm just doing the same thing that you did on my channel.
Oh yeah! Wasn't that in your new video? That was fun interrupting that.
Yeah, it was actually. And it's about the Schlieffen Plan as well and covers the topic more in depth. In fact, my channel, The Great War, has plenty of videos covering World War I topics in detail.
Well, I'll certainly check that new video out.
Best World War I channel there is.
Now, how do I get out of this cross promo?
I think you just kind of go.
Oh, okay. Ooh. Ooh.
Like Indy said, if you want to learn more specifically about the Schlieffen Plan and why it failed, check out the Great War's brand new video. My video will explore what would have happened if the Schlieffen Plan actually did work, however unlikely that would be. Keep in mind, this is alternate history, and before I get into the scenario, I have one thing to say. World War I is always particularly tricky in alternate history because the lead up to the war and the fighting itself have so many factors that combine into the single conflict.
Absolutely true, and as when we looked at the seminal catastrophe, which was the 4-part series from Extra History on the what we know as the July Crisis, which is that month between the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which was kind of the triggering event that led to a bunch of dominoes falling, and then the declaration of war at the end of July of 1914. There are so many times that they were just this close to averting the catastrophe, and if one little decision had gone another way, probably a dozen different times, things might have gone differently. Now, there will be those who argue that the war was inevitable, and if it hadn't happened then, it would have happened based on some other event. And you can make that argument. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that, but there were so many opportunities to stop this, and so there are so many just different diverging events that could have occurred here.
By imagining something as flawed as the Schlieffen Plan succeeding, something else would have to fail, or be entirely different. The Schlieffen Plan was doomed to fail from the start. At its conception in 1905, it was already flawed, but by 1914, it was inflexible, inaccurate, and just like many ideas in World War I, failed to adapt to the changing times.
I don't know if I completely agree that the Schlieffen Plan was fatally flawed. If there was a fatal flaw in it, it was the inflexibility of the leaders who carried it out. It was the unwillingness to adapt once things didn't go the way they expected. For example, taking Liège was supposed to take 2 days, and it took over 2 weeks. Adjusting for that is something that needed to be expected. We talked about this yesterday. No plan survives contact with the enemy, and they didn't allow for that. I think the plan itself could have worked if it factored in the possibility of needing to make adjustments.
So keep in mind, I'm going to have to change some factors in the war for the Schlieffen Plan to actually succeed. This isn't an 100% prediction, just a general exercise in theory. A game alternate history theory. Just as in our timeline, the Archduke is assassinated, Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia mobilizes on Austria, and Germany mobilizes on Russia and puts their plan into action. However, in this alternate timeline, the plan just goes perfectly. An imperialist German's best fantasy come to life. Very small resistance, undamaged railways, and a demoralized enemy. In our timeline, this was the exact opposite, but let's not crush little Germany's dreams. The Schlieffen Plan, as said before, was to bring a quick French surrender so that Germany could deal with Russia. So let's say that the Germans actually do quickly invade France like intended. In this alternate timeline, the Germans defeat the French overwhelmingly in a battle similar to the Battle of the Marne, except it ends in a French defeat.
Battle of the Marne, we're not going to, when I go there, I'm going to visit the areas of the Battle of the Marne, but I'm not really going to talk about the first Battle of the Marne. We are going to talk a lot about the second Battle of the Marne, which is the one that the Americans were involved in. It's one of 4 major battles that I'm going to be looking at when I go there in a couple weeks. But the Battle of the Marne is the turning point in the Western Front early in the war. It's the point at which Germany stops advancing toward Paris. It's where the French finally stop them. And it coincides with the Germans having to send troops east much earlier than expected because the Russians mobilized much quicker than expected. So yeah, there probably would be a battle like that, but it'd be more likely that there's a breakthrough quickly. And I agree with them 100% that the damaged railways, which go hand in hand with the delays that happen in Belgium, are a big factor.
However, one more factor would have to be eliminated for German victory in the West. The Schlieffen Plan did not account for one thing: America. No, I'm just kidding, the UK. In the original idea, Britain was never supposed to be involved in the war, but once Germany crossed into neutral Belgium, that changed. By declaring war on Germany, Germany's plans of a quick war fell apart, since the numbers weren't in their favor. In this alternate timeline, since we're talking about the Schlieffen Plan succeeding, we need to basically remove Britain from the war. The easiest way to do this was to have Belgium allow German troops to cross into France.
And I mentioned this yesterday. That, to me, is the decisive change that could alter the outcome of the war, is Belgium giving into the ultimatum to allow Germans to pass through unmolested. The Germans now get through Belgium 2 to 3 weeks faster than they otherwise would have. They don't deal with the damaged railways. That, Liège was a big hub for that because they needed to get their trains to pass through. They get into northern France. You don't have the British troops. There's a couple 100,000 British troops there by then. They start fighting. I think the Battle of Mons was the first place where they fight, the British and the Germans. All of that's off the table. I think Germany does indeed overwhelm France and take Paris. And some of you said yesterday, well, why do we assume that taking Paris ends the war? Well, the reason we assume that is because it happened 3 other times. In 1814, the first time Napoleon's defeated, one of the deciding factors in his defeat was that the French were defeated on the outskirts of Paris, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate by his own generals. In 1871, the Franco-Prussian War was effectively ended in January of 1871 when the Germans took Paris. And in 1940, the Germans take Paris, France capitulates. So it has happened time and time again. You can't really compare France to, say, Russia. Well, Napoleon took Moscow. Well, number one, Moscow wasn't the capital when Napoleon took it. But also, Russia is a completely different animal than France is. I do believe, had they just rushed in and taken Paris in those first 6 weeks, I think France probably negotiates and they get the outcome that they want in Germany.
However extremely unrealistic this may be, it's the only way Britain might not declare war and for the plan to succeed. By not having to fight a war against France and Britain, Germany would send most of its troops to the east to fight off the Russians. In our timeline, its ally Austria-Hungary was fighting a war against Russia in Little Serbia.
And not doing particularly well in those wars. Austria-Hungary had a large army, but a very poorly funded army. And I think for the most part, pretty poorly led too. They were nowhere near the army that France or Russia or Germany had. And Russia was a much better opponent than I think Austria-Hungary or Germany had expected them to be. But that said, Germany still kicks Russia's butt at Tannenberg, and you factor in additional troops going that way, I think Russia probably doesn't hold up.
And basically losing on both fronts. Even though people think of Russia as a backwater during this era, the nation was rapidly growing in power. When World War I came along, it was a force to be reckoned with, and Germans knew it. In our timeline, the Russians still suffered catastrophic defeats at the hands of Germany, such as in the Battle of Tannenberg. The Germans still were able to hold off the Russians with the forces they had, while still fighting on the Western Front at the same time. By 1917, the war was so bad for the Russians, they had a revolution. Without those forces fighting the British and French, it's easy to assume Germany could have pushed back Russia and helped out its ally Austria-Hungary in this alternate timeline.
And I still think a Russian revolution happens because I think most of the seeds of that revolution were sown in the decades before the Great War. It just took the catalyst of the Great War to finally push them over the edge. And so losing faster, I think, causes that to happen faster.
This would basically speed up the war far more quickly. Russia would rapidly begin to lose against the full German military. If Russians weren't demoralized, then the Eastern Front would be similar in our timeline, until Russia collapses.
I don't know if you'll talk about this or not, but I think another factor here is that if it happens like this, Italy probably either doesn't enter the war at all or enters on the side of the Central Powers. Remember, Italy, before World War I, was actually in an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but it was a defensive alliance, and it didn't obligate them to fight in an offensive war, and Germany was the one who went on the offensive in this war. So that took Italy out of their treaty obligations. But if they see a situation where the side they're kind of already on is winning rapidly, I don't see them jumping in on the side of the alliance.
The Ottoman Empire still would have become involved in the war. Even without the British Lawrence of Arabia, the Arab revolt would still have occurred anyway against Ottoman Turk rule. The entire empire would have collapsed anyway.
The Ottoman Empire was already on its way out. It had just lost a couple of wars in the Balkans. They were really on their last legs. I agree. I think that was going to happen regardless.
Even without the war, the empire was gradually decaying for centuries, losing the Balkans only a half-century earlier and facing resistance from Armenians and Kurds. It might not have been as quickly, but soon enough, the empire would dissolve. However, it's likely with the British and French out of the war, when the empire did collapse, it wouldn't be split by the Entente colonial powers.
Yeah, so, and this is something we've talked about a little bit here and there, that France and Germany, remember, the Ottomans fight with the Central Powers, and so France and Germany are their enemies, France and Britain are their enemies, and they go in and kind of pull a dirty trick on some of the Arabs and some of the the folks in the Middle East and promise one thing but then secretly decide to divvy it up on their own, and so that's how you end up with Syria and Iraq and Saudi Arabia and all these kind of the beginning stages of some of these countries.
But by local powers themselves. So one positive fact in this timeline is that the jagged borders of the Middle East wouldn't be drawn, changing the modern history of the region. Now I can feel my freedom sense tingling, so I know that means I have to talk about America. In our timeline, even though the United States came late into the war, the US was still dramatically changed by their involvement.
I will say this, it's interesting that it talks about the US here, because that looks like, I think that's King George V. It's sometimes hard to tell. Yeah, I think it's got to be, because this looks like a British helmet. King George V and Tsar Nicholas II, who were cousins, looked a lot alike. So sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, but I think that's King George V.
Late into the war, the US was still dramatically changed by their involvement in the conflict. Industry boomed to supply arms, rations, and goods. The federal government expanded to accommodate for the draft and the national war effort. Most importantly, it transformed how the US would act on the global scale, or at least it was a preview. For the first time ever, the United States was involved in European affairs, fighting and negotiating in the future of the continent. World War I showed the US could be influential politically, financially, and militarily. In this alternate timeline, since the war ends in a German victory, or ends before the United States has a reason to enter the war, the US would remain in an isolationist attitude.
I agree, and I think that this dramatically changes the fortunes of the balance of power between Europe and the United States. I think Germany becomes, they were already probably the dominant power in Europe, and this solidifies and only grows that, and I think that puts them on the world stage in a pretty big way, to where we don't think of the U.S. as becoming the dominant Western superpower. That could be Germany in this case.
Disconnected from the affairs of Europe. Since World War II never would occur in this alternate timeline, the US could very well remain isolationist for much of the 20th century. The United States also never faces the brash new face of nationalism as a result of the war. With this nationalism came a resentment for German Americans. Up until this point, German Americans had lived in the United States for years, with strong connection to their heritage. Some still even spoke their language in parts of the Midwest. However, once the war came, xenophobia forced them to shed their language and heritage to appear more American.
And a lot of people don't realize this, but German is one of the most significant heritages that we have as Americans, especially in this part of the country where I live, Pennsylvania, Ohio, places like that. The area where I live, the township over for me is Berlin Township. It's heavily German where we live, and Pennsylvania was heavily German. And the town I grew up in had a street called Dutch Lane. Dutch, was close enough to German because Deutsch, Dutch, Pennsylvania Dutch is actually not Dutch. It's actually a dialect of German and English. But, it's a derivative of that word Deutsch, which is, for German. They changed the name during World War I to Liberty Street. from Dutch Lane because of the connotation of it being kind of a little bit German.
In this alternate timeline, today America has a much more prominent German heritage in its culture and national identity. Assimilation into speaking English would have taken much longer in this timeline, though.
So you see there, the ancestry with largest population in the county. This is where I live right here. You see all of that is more German than anything else. And, you know, part of that is how people identify. I still would argue that in the Northeast and in this area that British is probably more, you know, Irish, English, Scottish, Welsh is more prominent than German, but I think people identify more with their German heritage than people who have British heritage of one form or another. Maybe not Irish specifically, but I think that's part of it too, because this is all basically how people themselves say that they identify.
What would Germany and Europe look like if the Schlieffen Plan had been successful? Well, if the plan was a success and resulted in a victory on both fronts, we'd see a victorious Central Powers in this alternate timeline. The conditions of surrender would go to France, and perhaps Russia if they weren't wrapped in a civil war. The exact terms of the conditions can't be 100% predicted. However, it's likely Germany would use the war to expand its influence. It could put war reparations on France, much like those put on Germany in our timeline.
Which had been done previously after the Franco-Prussian War. So this would be the second time in a little over 40 years that happened to France.
Annex parts of resource-rich French territory and small kingdoms like Luxembourg. The specifics are too hard to truly predict. What is known is that it could lead to an age of German dominance in Europe. Now, when making this video, I discovered more and more information. I really want to get into the specifics with how Germany could have handled winning the war, as well as how this could affect the world. I don't want to oversimplify this scenario, so I'll make a part 2 to this video, which will be released in a few days. What do you think would have happened had the Schlieffen Plan been successful? Say in the comments, like on Facebook, and subscribe if you have not done so. This is Cody from the Alternate History Hub.
All right, good stuff. I guess there's a part 2, so we'll look at that tomorrow while I continue to work on my video to give you a little bit of a preview of the upcoming trip to France. I'm pretty confident at this point that they're not going to restrict travel more significantly than they already have, to the point where I'll have to cancel the trip. So I'm feeling pretty good about being able to go, but we'll see. Fingers crossed. Keep them crossed for me. Make sure, like I said, that you're subscribed and turn on your notifications so when I do post that video, you'll have it available to you right away. And we'll take a look at part 2 of this tomorrow. Thanks for watching.